Ontario is a proud native San Franciscan. I assume you're proud. You're proud of San Francisco? Right. A proud San Francisco. An alum of the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania with a degree in economics. He completed the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce's Leadership San Francisco program and is on the board of directors of SPUR. Ontario?
Thank you. I was a little surprised by that intro. I thought you were going to say, get up there. On behalf of PG&E, I want to thank everyone for being here. As Michael explained, infrastructure is critical to our future. We've spent a great deal of time working with our partners in the public and private sector to chart a future for PG&E, in particular where power outages are less frequent, where we incorporate larger amounts of solar and wind onto the grid. And so this initiative is key to understanding what investments we need to make, and importantly, how we explain those investments to our partners and our customers so that they appreciate the importance of infrastructure. Today we have two wonderful speakers that are going to talk in some detail about one of the most critical components of our business, which is how we incorporate renewables and those resources into our grid, and what sort of changes physically from a policy standpoint need to be made to ensure that incorporation leads to a more robust grid that reflects the priorities of the 21st century. So without any further ado, I want to introduce today's speakers. First is Commissioner Carla Peterman, who was appointed to the California Public Utilities Commission by Governor Jerry Brown in December 2012. Commissioner Peterman is the CPUC's assigned commissioner for a number of proceedings, including the Renewables Portfolio Standard, Alternative Transportation, and Energy Storage. She was previously appointed by Governor Brown in 2011 to the California Energy Commission, where she was lead commissioner for renewables, transportation, natural gas, and the 2012 Independent Energy Policy Report. She's the first African-American female to be appointed to both commissions. Congratulations. Commissioner Peterman earned a master's in science degree and a master's in business administration from Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. She's currently finishing her doctoral studies in energy and resources at University of California at Berkeley. Commissioner Peterman is also a proud alum of Howard University. Next is Arno Harris, who's the CEO of Recurrent Energy, one of North America's leading solar project development companies, with 2 gigawatts of solar projects in development and more than 1.4 gigawatts contracted with utilities. Arno is a passionate advocate for solutions to climate change through the intersection of business and public policy. He spent more than a decade working in the solar industry to make solar transition to the mainstream, and for his success and entrepreneurial spirit and contributions to that industry, in 2013, Arno was named most admired CEO by the San Francisco Business Times. So please welcome Commissioner Peterman and Arno Harris.
Hi, Arno. You can call me Carla just for as fast as I can. So we thought the way we might do this is each offer up a few comments at the beginning on this very big topic, and then just have a dialogue. And I think we are both open to having you raise questions. This is such a massive topic that there's so many directions we could take this. And I just have to say, first of all, thank you all for coming to hear us talk. And there are some seats up front if anyone's looking for a chair. I was particularly excited about this topic. For those who don't know, the Public Utilities Commission, we regulate a lot. Electric, gas, water, moving companies, railroad safety, and so sometimes it can make your head spin. But what has been increasingly come to my attention over my time on the commission is just how integrated all these different sectors are, and particularly how critical the issue of infrastructure development is in each one. And to be frank, it's a little scary. When you're talking about water issues, you realize that the infrastructure is aging. When we're talking about electric, similar situation. And as a state, we did a lot of our development around the same time in the 50s, and so we're starting to see that infrastructure really starting to wear around the same time. But what could be viewed as potentially a crisis, I think is an opportunity. It gives us an opportunity to design all these infrastructures in a way where they're able to support each other. For example, the issue of data came up earlier, and we spend a lot of time thinking about how data is going to help us in the 21st century with electricity. It's going to allow consumers to better manage their energy, do more demand response. Well, you can't talk about data and not want to make sure that we have sufficient broadband infrastructure. And there are parts of our states where that still doesn't exist. And so it's really important, no matter what type of infrastructure you're interested in, to be supportive of overall in all of our sectors building up that network. In terms of today's topic, renewables and renewables integration, before I came to the CEC, I did research on solar, and very much was a passion of mine. And then as I began to work on renewables at the Energy Commission, as well as natural gas, I became increasingly concerned with the challenges of integrating renewables, especially as we've seen our mix of energy switch from one that is dominated on the renewable side from geothermal and wind to a portfolio that has more solar. And solar power has wonderful attributes for our system, low carbon, modularity, et cetera, and the costs have come down tremendously. But there's a specific load profile when we talk about solar energy. It comes on in the morning, goes off at night, around the same time, and so suddenly we have to figure out how do you supply power 24/7 with a profile that's intermittent. And the thing about balancing the grid is it's not easy. Instantaneously, your power in has to match your power out. And so what we talk about integrating renewables is how do we put these new technologies on our system, both the energy and literally interconnect them without having the customer feel any different. Because the interesting thing about where we're going, we're supportive of renewables because it helps with our climate change goals, but customers still expect going forward that the system will be as or more safe, reliable, and affordable. And it's a difficult task, if you will. I think someone described it, changing the engine out of your car while going at full speed. And so that's ultimately what we're trying to do from an infrastructure perspective. So I think Arno's going to talk in particular about what haven't changed about the distribution system, but let me offer a couple comments on the type of infrastructure investments we're going to need going forward for different types of renewables, and particularly distributed generation versus larger scale. As before that, I'll tell you kind of where we are with renewables very quickly. So we have a target for the state to have 33% of our generation come from renewable energy, and we are well on our way to that target. Statewide, about 23% of our power now comes from renewables. For our investor-owned utilities like PG&E, Edison, and San Diego, they're at 25%. And we've seen a significant growth in the amount of distributed generation in terms of renewables. And those are smaller wind and PV systems. So we have a program that supports, for example, incentives for rooftop solar. That program is nearing the end of completion because it's been so successful. We've had over 1,700 megawatts of distributed generation solar installed, and we're seeing people install it even in the absence of incentives. And so we have some challenges both with thinking about having smaller systems than we historically have, as well as having systems, as I said, with generation profiles that are different than a traditional gas plant. And so what does the grid need to look like in order to incorporate distributed generation? Well, one, it needs to be able to facilitate two-way power flow. We're used to a very centralized system where power comes from the plant and then comes out to all of us. But suddenly the lines of who the generator and who the consumer are getting blurred. So your customer suddenly, me in my home, I can be a consumer of power, but I can also be a generator of power. And historically, I would say our grid hasn't accommodated that. And I would say now our utilities are open to distributed generation, but still, even if you put your policy in that direction or your economic incentives, if your grid can't technically handle that, you're really not maximizing that resource. So we need a grid that can do that. We need a grid that is customer-centric, acknowledging that customers want to play a more active role in their energy management. Not just energy generation, but also, for example, providing energy efficiency services to the grid or demand response. A lot more activity is going to happen at the distribution system. Historically, most of it's happened at the transmission level, which has a different set of tariffs, a different type of regulatory model. So if we're going to be doing more in the distribution system, we've got to now think more about how that system is run, organized, the transparency of that system. It's pretty engineering and black box at this point. and how the power is going to flow between the distribution system and the transmission system. In terms of integrating renewables, so when I talk about this issue of how is it that we're going to keep the load profile, the supply balanced, right? The way we've historically helped to manage that ramp of solar has been through natural gas. But we've got these really aggressive greenhouse gas targets. So we need to think about what are some low carbon alternatives to managing that fluctuation. And so two of the ones that I work on are energy storage and electric vehicles. And now I'm quick to say these are two of the tools that should be in your tool set. There's other things we can do like resource diversity and regional coordination, but these are some of the ones that are less developed. So what energy storage is exactly what it sounds like. Someone called it sophisticated Tupperware. It's a way to store electricity at times when you have a lot of it, but it's not needed, and deploy it at higher value times. Because as I was saying, when the sun's shining, you can't cut it off, right? And so we're actually starting to see times in the system when there's more supply of solar power than the demand is at that point. So how great is it if we can take something like a battery or a flywheel, store some of that excess electricity, and use that at a later time? Similarly with wind at night, sometimes it blows more than we need, our demand is lower at night, can we shift it to other times of the day? Energy storage, until recently, and perhaps even so now, was viewed as kind of the holy grail and a little bit unattainable because the economics just didn't work out. But now we're going into a phase of time where I think that it's possible. And so the commission set targets for our investor-owned utilities this past year for energy storage, the first in the nation, and we're seeing a good response. Later this year, our utilities will do the first solicitation for these technologies. It's a starting point. Our targets, although viewed as big, only represent about 2% of the peak load of utilities in 2020. But if we're able to develop this technology, this is one of those new types of grid assets that can be of value. And then finally, electric vehicles. What's interesting about them is, if our problem was we have too much generation at certain times, well, they need power. And so what a better situation than to take electric vehicles, charge them at times when we have excess power. I mean, they have batteries built into them, so they're effectively like a moving form of energy storage. Now, we're investing heavily in electric transportation for our greenhouse gas goals, since transportation represents about 40% of our emissions. So historically, the commission had looked at EVs and said, oh, there's this big load that's coming on the system. How do we just manage the impacts of the grid? How can we make sure that it doesn't affect the grid? And that's a real consideration. But we're trying to move further than that and think about how do we maximize the value of these vehicles? Because suddenly, if you think about them, if they can turn their charge up and turn their charge down in response to price signals, these vehicles, you as a driver, could be providing a demand response service, an energy storage system to the grid. And so those are a couple of things that we're looking at that would change how we use the grid. So I will stop. Oh, actually, I won't stop there. I will just give you this teaser because it will come out in our discussion. And we said 5 minutes, but there's so much going on. There are a number of proceedings at the commission that are taking on these issues of infrastructure development. And just to highlight a few for you, we just recently opened up a proceeding for the utilities to file distribution resource plans. Legislation directed last year that the utilities file plans that identify what are the barriers to putting distributed generation on the grid. What are the technical barriers? What are some of the economic barriers? Because the goal is not to just accommodate distributed generation, but how do we really support it and celebrate it? Another proceeding we have that's related is our interconnection proceeding. How do we better connect these resources to the system? As I mentioned, we have our energy storage proceeding where we're looking at how to develop energy storage on the grid. We also have alternative vehicle proceeding. And then finally, an interesting one is our data access decision that we recently passed. One of the things we've heard from third-party providers, people who could do energy efficiency, is give us the data, help us understand what customer behavior is, and we'll come up with a business model that will get you those resources that you're interested in. And so we've made now opportunities for data to become more accessible to researchers, third parties, than we have before. And so I think that's going to be helpful in us figuring out how to design this grid of the future. Thank you.
That was great. I think a lot of what I offered in my opening comments will reinforce a lot of what Carlos talked about. But I think one of the things that strikes me is when you talk about this topic, it often gets overwhelming really, really quickly. There are so many technical issues when you talk about storage. smart inverters, you can talk about flywheels and all sorts of different technologies. You can talk about the economic side of things, you know, the market design and all the pieces that are going to hold this together. And we can talk about, you know, all the potential spending as well, spending on transmission, spending on generation, and putting it all together into coherent pictures can sometimes be a little bit challenging. So for me, the thing that enables me to sort of bring it all back together and make sense of it is really to remember that, you know, infrastructure is put in place in service of its customers. And at the end of the day, I think Michael laid it out really nicely that the point of infrastructure is to enable California's economy and enable our residential customers to enjoy a level of service and reliability and quality of life, and our businesses to be able to enjoy the access to the resources they need to be successful. And if you think about sort of the two big things that are driving change, that are causing us to have to wrestle with all these issues and think about what choices we need to make for our energy future and infrastructure future, to me, I think it really comes down to two big ideas. One is we're going to get a lot cleaner, and the other is customers are demanding a lot more choice in terms of, you know, how they get their energy, where their energy comes from, how they use it, and ultimately how much it costs. And I think for me, what I'll try to do then is try and use that framework, the idea of the system getting a lot cleaner, and the idea of offering customers more choice as a way of beginning to share the way I think about all these different technologies and different issues that are out there that ultimately lead us to this system in the future that enables California to continue on its path to prosperity. So first, in terms of making the system more clean, it's very, very clear that California wants to take a leadership role, that from a standpoint of it's been tested in this legislature through AB 32, it's been tested in the polls through numerous ballot measures, and tested through public opinion numerous times, and there is a real desire on the part of California to demonstrate that we can clean up our air, clean up the way electricity is generated, and we can actually make a substantial movement forward as well in terms of California's contribution to climate change. The good news on that front is that we're moving out of the old debate. The old debate used to be about how expensive renewables were, and the reality is today that wind and solar have come to a place where they're effectively competitive with natural gas. And so we're now facing a future where instead of worrying about the cost of generation, we're really at a place where it's clear that wind, solar, and natural gas, some mix of those three, really will define the future. The interesting challenge is the one that Carla touched on, which is really as you start to contemplate going to higher levels of renewables. The state has targeted 33%. We're going to get there by 2020. AB 32, though, and it contemplates getting to 80% below our 2012 emissions levels by the time we get to 2050. Getting there is going to require us to think about getting to levels of renewables that are probably north of 70, 80%. And so that really takes us completely into a very, very different place. And it raises all sorts of issues because we're fundamentally turning the system around as you get to putting more renewables on the system. You're talking about moving from fossil fire generation, which is controllable, to lots and lots of wind and solar, which are very, very clean, but they're not dispatchable. And so the interesting consensus that's been emerging is that you look at this issue, you think about how do we redesign the system to incorporate all these renewables, is that there's a consensus that's building around the idea of flexibility. And really what we need to move to is a system that enables us to move energy around regionally, a system that allows us to store energy at the bulk level, and then when you look at the distribution grid, a system that allows us to control the way the load, when people use energy and how much energy they're using, and something that also allows energy to be generated right there at the end of the system. There have been a number of studies coming out that I think are increasing people's confidence about the fact that we can deploy the technologies. The technologies exist today. We can put the transmission in place. We can put the connections between us and our neighbors. to be able to create that level of flexibility that will get us to that level. The real question is, how do we ensure that doing that maintains the other values of the system, primarily affordability? And I think that's going to be the interesting thing that we're wrestling with as we think about things like storage and transmission and different types of markets. When I think about then the second area, sort of customer choice, I think renewables clearly play a very big role there as well, in the form of distributed generation. And as Carla mentioned, one of the interesting things is as the cost of solar generation has come down, we're at a place now where we're seeing solar being picked up by homeowners and businesses because, even without incentives, because it makes sense for them, at that cost, right there for them putting that system on their building. And so it's something where, you listen to all the various analysts, whether Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs and just about every other big bank out there that looks at this sector, there's sort of an aha moment that's happened where people realize the cost trajectory of solar is just going to keep coming down, and distributed generation of solar on rooftops is going to be an inevitable part of this future. And again, at much higher levels of penetration than we've seen in the past. And the key thing becomes, looking at the distribution infrastructure, is how do utilities and how do regulators and how do system operators look at operating a network where you've got people generating power and using power and doing it in a way that it may not be perfectly predictable. And again, I think you have an idea here of flexibility as well as greater visibility and control of that system. So we see behind the meter storage being deployed, we see demand response that effectively allows customers to determine when they use power and how they use it, whether that's a smart water heater or a smart thermostat or some other type of smart device or an electric vehicle charging in their home. And it also comes down to technologies that broadly fall under the idea of a smart grid, things that allow the utility and allow system operators to have greater visibility into what's going on the distribution system and greater control over how much electricity is being fed in, or also being able to take electricity out of that system. But all of those pieces together, sort of the stuff that's happening at the wholesale level, utility scale level, on the transmission grid, and the things that are happening on the distribution grid, I think the overall sort of message I think is important to start with is this is in the interest of California. It's what Californians want to do. It's in the interest of serving customer choice, giving them a greater degree of control and input into how they use power, where it comes from, and how much it costs. And at the end of the day, the technologies exist. The real key for us is how do we come together and make decisions about how to deploy those technologies in the right order, in the right places, at the right cost, to ensure that as we make a cleaner system, as we make a system that offers more choice, we do it in a way that maintains reliability, maintains affordability. And I think that one of the reasons that we decided to sign on as a sponsor to the Bay Area Council's report is a key part of making that case and of moving that conversation forward is bringing the general public along. And it brings me back to sort of my opening comment that this topic is often so complicated, full of so many different details, people have a hard time putting together. We need to be effective in making the case to the general public and the business community that this investment's needed. It's going to deliver important values, and we can do it in a way that ultimately is going to maintain an affordable system and one that ultimately supports the prosperity of the state in an exciting future. So there's so much in this topic that I'm really excited to get into this conversation. So I'm going to bring my opening remarks to an end there, and we'll open it up. And Carla and I are hopefully going to be able to kind of do a fun dynamic back and forth here. So who gets the first question? It's like a jump ball.
I'll ask the first question. First of all, I always like when you speak, you have this tone that calms things. I just came from a lot of meetings, so I'm like, I'm going to save the grid. So one of the things that came up in your comments, and as well as mine, is the importance of customer choice, this customer-centric model. But you and I both know that most customers don't know much about electricity or pay much attention. People will cite the statistic that people spend 7 minutes a year looking at their electric bill. And then there are some that we engage with which are watching every kilowatt, hour on their smart meter. So Now, as we think about this very participatory network, which is somewhat we've been alluding to, how much do you imagine customers are actually actively managing their energy generation or their consumption, or how much of it is plug and play, if you will, and then kind of what are some of the technical issues that may come up with that?
I think it's got to be that plug and play model. When I think about, I mean, if you take something like a smartphone, right? I mean, if you understood the level of complexity that exists just in a simple web query or something else, right? I mean, there's big database queries, there's all these servers that are being balanced, there are these packet routes that are being optimized. If you had to make choices about all that stuff, you never get past that first search, right? I think at the end of the day, that's kind of the smart that's in the smart grid concept, which is, yeah, I don't really want to spend my time pouring over the bill and figuring out, hoping that if I make one change to when my dishwasher runs, I'll see it in the next bill and then I can move what happens. I really want to have some sort of smart thing in my home that communicates with the big energy hungry devices, the dryer, the washer, the hot water heater, a few other things. And basically just I have maybe a couple options I can choose, right? Which is I want to do, I don't care about the cost, I want to do my stuff whenever I want to, or yeah, I only want to do it at certain times and not others, or I really want to do it only when it's absolutely most expensive. The rest of that is all pretty easy to optimize. I think once you have a clear picture of, at the system level, there's something that's sending a signal about what the system status is. Is the system short of electricity, or has it got lots of excess electricity? In which case, it's going to send a signal to those devices that says, either use it or conserve it. So I think it's difficult for us to think about doing that if it involves lots of work, but automating that, I think, is fundamentally pretty easy to solve.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think one of the things that's come up a lot more at the PUC is the importance of communication protocol, communication software, and a community that a business community, we haven't interacted with as much. I mean, you think about some of the technologies that we use in our business, these are assets that have life of 50, 60 years. Even something like your washing machine will last a lot longer than your iPhone. And so how quickly we're able to introduce these communication technologies into these appliances is going to be a real issue. But I agree.
One of the things I think that touches on, and this begins to go down the rabbit hole of all these really interesting but very arcane topics, but is the question of whether or not you solve that. I think there are a lot of advocates who say we should solve that with a market, right? There should be a price signal at instantaneous or a cost of electricity that reflects the availability of power at any given moment, versus more of a regulatory approach, right? Where every year you guys sit down and figure out, okay, how much assets are going into the rate base, how much usage are we seeing at different times of day, let's set a tariff that knocks it out between 2 and 4, 4 and 6, and the rest of the time. And I can see arguments for both, I think, in different situations. But I think making that choice is going to be key, because then the technology that gets deployed is going to have to be built around either a market or some sort of tariff.
Yeah, no, I don't think they're necessarily, you can't do them together. I mean, ultimately, we have to decide what the revenue requirement is, what does the utility need to earn to run the system, but then how you end up apportioning that revenue can take different approaches. And I'm an economist by training, and so on a surface, I support, prices that reflect the actual cost. But there are also reasons why we haven't done it that way. And I think the challenge on the energy side is that we have never really done that. And so how do you transition that to people? I mean, people have been protected from some of the price fluctuations. And partly, some of the things we're trying to accomplish actually require you to see the price fluctuations. Like, we want people to see that it's really expensive to use power at this time of day so that they don't. But it's just such a different approach. And what I struggle with is, I think you can't do that without technology, without loads, your washing machine or whatever, being able to respond to those price signals. Because if you don't respond to those signals, then you're going to pay more than you do now. And so I do struggle with, wanting to make sure that everyone is able to participate and benefit from something like time of use pricing. And we really deal with some people. I get handwritten letters still from people who complain about their rates, or who tell me how they just can't afford another penny. And it's a struggle about how do you take care of folks in that situation while keep pushing the envelope. And I mean, I think partly I'm a fan of you set your prices where they need to be, and then you have complementary programs that help those who are low income. But I mean, PG&E can speak to this more directly, but I think something like a third of the customers in PG&E territory are currently eligible, at least a third, for care of the low income assistant rates. And that's the situation we're in, where rates are out of place, or costs are out of place, where, or the economy is out of place, where a lot of customers just can't even afford the system now.
Inevitably, all these conversations come back to these kind of complex issues.
But I think we need to move forward. It's just about how do you do that transition.
Yeah. One of the things you touched on that I'm really interested in is electric vehicles and the opportunity there. And it seems it's one of these things that just is like it's this trifecta of goodness, because under, you know, if you look at just major sources of carbon, it's electricity, it's buildings, and it's transportation. Right? Transportation is such an obvious one. And as we're seeing already with like the liquid fuels today, like changing the makeup of liquid fuels is going to be complicated and difficult. And it's really hard to see how, you know, we're just by changing out liquid fuels, we're going to get either to zero carbon goal that we've got, or very low carbon goal that we've got for transportation, or, you know, how we're going to do it and not be really expensive. So electric vehicles suddenly pop up. It's like this amazing, first of all, it's this amazing fuel switch, right? You move people off of liquid fuels and you move their transportation is on electric. It solves another problem. And the next thing is, one of the big issues utilities face with issues like distributed generation and other things is, and increasing energy efficiency, is that your business models have often been predicated on growing electricity consumption. It's been flat. But if you bring electric vehicles into the mix, you suddenly provide a market for electricity for utilities. And then you've got this rate system also that provides flexibility because of, as you mentioned, the storage, right? You've got all these charging stations all over the state, and they can be in people's offices, they can be by the side of the road, they can be in people's homes. And if those are all centrally controlled, then the guys that are building those things are already building that control into their systems. Then all of a sudden you can say, charge faster, charge slower, right? And provide flexibility. I mean, it just seems amazing. So I'm curious how you're looking at that in terms of how quickly you roll it out, or how you get that going and support it from the PUC side.
Yeah, so I do think it's amazing. I think it's also fairly complicated. It's a little scary, you know, but exciting, you know, distributed generation and distributed resources as a concept, because having all these little power plants, et cetera, and I think we're still trying to figure out how it's all coordinated. I mean, there's not one person sitting in a room who sees the whole world, and so, you know, I struggle sometimes with that. But yeah, so just a little bit about how we're dealing with electric vehicles. And I'll say the big driver recently too has been around ozone. So we still have in California the #1 and 2 worst non-attainment zones for ozone in Southern California, well, San Joaquin Valley and the LA Basin, which is a function of geography as well as industry, et cetera. And there are more stringent targets coming into place for 2032, and those targets are actually more binding than our greenhouse gas targets in terms of the need to reduce the carbon in the system. So in addition to electric vehicles, we're also making a big push on fuel cell vehicles that run on hydrogen. But if you make your hydrogen from electrolysis, from renewables, that also adds a real load to for the utilities. And so there's a lot of kind of good opportunities happening. So what we're doing on electric vehicles is, when we started looking seriously at electric vehicles in 2009, there was one EV on the road, the Tesla Roadster. And now there's something like over 25 vehicles out there, and the costs are really low, and not, relatively low. I mean, you can get these leases now for under $200, and I have to applaud the automakers for kind of being aggressive on the pricing. But the interesting thing, these vehicles come in different ways. I mean, there's pure batteries, there's things that are run on part battery, part gas, and so it is complicated to figure out how do you design an infrastructure that can support a real diversity of vehicles, where people may, as you pointed out, the beauty is electricity is ubiquitous. The challenge is electricity is ubiquitous. So you can charge at your house, you can maybe charge at your office, you might want to charge at a public station that's more centralized. And so the utilities have been doing load research to get a sense of where people are charging, to see, you know, are there particular parts of the distribution grid that are starting to see a lot of activity. I mean, it's one of those things, your neighbor gets an EV, you get an EV, and so you can have some significant grid impacts. But we're also trying to encourage this. And so we've waived kind of the distribution upgrade cost for residential customers who have EVs at this point, because we've not seen the cost to be exorbitant. We're gonna check on that in a few years. We're also starting down this path of looking at how do we integrate these vehicles into the grid? And we call that vehicle grid integration. So what are the steps you need to take to see if something could be ramped up or ramped down, if you could have it as a storage asset? Well, it's a lot of really fundamental things, like what is the asset we're talking about? Is it the battery? Is it the vehicle? At what level would you want to provide that service to the grid? Is it just one vehicle, or do we want a third party to aggregate all these vehicles? What's the program by which the utilities would pay for these services? What's the value of these services? And so there's modeling being done, but I'm also a big fan of pilots. Put something out there, because we can spin ourselves silly trying to do analysis, but there's no actual operational data when you do. And so we have our utilities that are doing a number of different pilots related to electric vehicles. And a part of our proceeding now is figuring out how do we incorporate that learning to what we're doing. We're also looking at what is the utility's role in terms of supporting infrastructure. When you talk about infrastructure, it's not just the charging kind of paddles, it's also everything from this, the service box to the wiring. And so, there's a lot of potential opportunities for the utilities, but the broader question too, when you talk about utility investment, specifically when you talk about utility investment, you're asking the question about what has value to ratepayers to pay for, and it has to be something that has value to all the ratepayers that are paying into that system. And so the interesting thing about a lot of distributed generation opportunities is there's a lot of private value and societal value. Sometimes those numbers aren't perfectly aligned, and so we're kind of always facing that question too from people, hey, I don't have an electric vehicle, I don't have a solar panel system, why am I paying for it? And so you're kind of making that case as something we continue to do. Do you have thoughts on making that case?
It's you mean the case around what utilities will be
Or
for the vehicle charging?
No, just in terms of, what are some of those broader societal values to justify ratepayer benefit into something that has some private return?
Wow, you're the economist. I'm gonna go with what you said. I think those are really tricky issues to weigh. I think the interesting one is this question in California right now, what role utilities are going to play on EVs, and I think it comes back again to that question of how do you ensure that you're creating a viable business for utilities as the system goes through big change, and yet at the same time, we talk about creating a system that also helps California businesses thrive. You want to make sure that you're not extending the regulated monopoly to an extent that you're stifling other business opportunities.
Unnecessarily so.
Yeah. And so I think there's some really interesting questions there. My gut is to think that the best way to resolve it is the way that we've resolved it in other similar areas like generation, where the regulated utility is kept sort of in the area where there is truly a natural monopoly that makes sense to put in the ratepayers for, and allow utilities through unregulated norms to participate in some of those other competitive businesses to serve customers. So, see, I solved it.
So we can take questions.
Well, there's other thing. I think
Okay.
you touched on something that I think you're also very closely associated with, which is the idea of pilots, and specifically, you came to the commission and were associated very quickly with a really compelling pilot, which is the storage effort in California. So
I like that you called it a pilot, not a mandate.
Well, words matter, right?
Yeah.
But I think it does have the value of a pilot in that it's a step forward to actually try to put some rubber on the road,
Yeah.
see what happens, but it also recognizes, I think, that we don't have all the answers right now. When we talk about technology and we talk about the future, we're really talking about a series of unknowns that are going to unfold over time. And those unknowns are the technical capabilities, they're also the deployment architectures, and they are cost. And so a approach like the pilot or mandate is effectively a way to test and begin to get the oar in the water and see if you tell utilities they have to do this, where are they going to start to do it? And what solutions is business sort of environment, the ecosystem is going to present to utilities, and what do we learn from it? And then we take another step from there, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly, that sums it up really well. I mean, I'm really proud of that decision. Before putting out a proposed decision, I put out a signed commissioner ruling to give people a sense of what we wanted to do on energy storage. Because I'd been on the job for 6 months, a lot of people knew who I was, and this is kind of a new thing, and so we wanted to put it out there. And I knew that I wanted to recommend targets, but with some off-ramps, acknowledging that we don't know everything. And I think sometimes we make the mistake, whoever we are, business, a regulator, by assuming a certainty where there is none. And so you have to, I wanted to send a strong enough signal. I think people refer to it as like kind of indicative policy. Okay, this is the direction we're heading. But acknowledge what we don't know. And so we're reviewing the program in 3 years. We set these targets, but we said, hey, utilities, if you put these proposals through your methodologies and you don't find viable and cost-effective projects, you can defer the target for 2 more years. You don't get to get rid of it, but you get to defer it. We encourage utility ownership, so 50% to 50% of the target the utility can own. We also allow for the utility to own behind the meter, which is not traditional. Because again, I think a lot of these lines are becoming blurred. And we want to think about, I'd like to see the utilities, putting their best foot forward in terms of looking for opportunities here, and the same thing with third parties. And so, I think it's important to kind of be honest with people about where we are, because, I think one of the things, when I started at the Energy Commission as an aside, during my time at the Energy Commission, there was the issue with Solyndra, and people seeming absolutely shocked that like a company with a new technology could go under. And anyone who does investment, the portfolio, California's portfolio of investment in clean energy has done incredibly well. We look at our state research funds, really have paid off more so than you would see in other type of private portfolio. But where we did wrong was we didn't alert people to the fact that it was necessary for certain things to fail. And that not every technology that comes in on day one is what we're going to need in 20 years. And so I try to be open about that with the work we're doing, that there's a certain amount of investment that's reasonable if we're going to try out new models to come up with some products that are new. And so what qualifies as energy, what's going to be successful in energy storage in this next solicitation may or may not be what we want in 20 years. And so, the fascinating thing is we put out these targets. There's been a lot of world response. I've done lots of webinars in other parts of the world. And right now, as we're processing the utility applications, we're dealing with the fundamental question of what qualifies as energy storage. Because energy storage is really just energy management that captures the energy management we haven't been doing in other forums, right? But it's an artificial characterization, and so some ways I have to remind people we have to put things in boxes in order to figure out how to manage them procedurally, but let's not limit our own actual thinking to those boxes, because these things really, there's a fluidity between these technologies. And so think about something like solar PV, rooftop solar PV was often identified for me as, hey, this is a resource that needs something to integrate it. But now we're working on smart inverters, and these resources can actually integrate themselves. And so I think, I am open to the fact that we just don't know how things are going to turn out. I hope that does not inspire confidence. But
Well, no, what I'd say is the evidence is that it's actually having a huge effect, and I know from our own company, Recurrent Energy, we're developing solar projects all over the place. But we now, in every single one of our interconnection pilots, also reserved for a storage application, and we're also developing a number of standalone solar or storage segments. And so that signal, I think, has been key for us, but also for the whole ecosystem of developers to say, wow, California is going to go in this direction, and we're going to start exploring how to make it work.
Yeah, I'm a pragmatic idealist. I know where we want to go, but I know hopefully I'll be long enough in my career that I don't want it to mess up. And so, I try to be thoughtful about kind of, putting reasonable markers in place and then being willing to change.
Which I think is exactly the kind of leadership we need.
Can I ask you, what more do you need from us? What if you had your wand and you could hypnotize me while I'm sleeping? What would you like me to do?
Gosh, where do I start? I do think that it's really we're beginning to look, in storage. We're looking, beyond even that initial mandate. I think the big question that's going to come out of this period is going to be how are we paying for that service, and is it enough to sustain the investment in the the actual source assets that get deployed. And right now, the big uncertainty for us is it's still not clear what the revenue model is.
Yeah.
We look at capacity payments are the kind of key way to do it. And that's the way we do our modeling. It sort of barely gets you there. And so I think we're really going to want the PUC, as it looks at the results of this first effort, to think about how to ensure that we get the right model there that equitably values the benefits of the distributed system.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think one of the challenges is, so when we did this, we hired Kima and EPRI to do this modeling about cost effectiveness for storage, and found a lot of cases the benefits outweigh the cost, but there's a lot of assumptions embedded in there, and assumptions about revenue you can get from the ISO, for example, and so I think the challenge is the different places where you can get revenue, ancillary services, capacity markets, now resource adequacy, they were all designed for natural gas plants. And so each of those has to go through its own evolution to not be that way. And even though and I don't even think it's people intentionally trying to close out things, but you have to really change your mind around to think about capacity being energy efficiency, or capacity being something that is variable generation. And I think we can have, even if something can't be there 100% of the time, if you have some certainty about what percentage of time it will be, then you can have some faith in that. And so it's just so many different things have to change. And we started off with pretty small targets for the first period, and I kind of reminded people got really excited about these targets. I said, well, our first solicitation doesn't even happen until the end of 2014. By the time the utility shows a short list, get these contracts out, you're not going to see things really on the ground in 2016, and then that's just the first small one, and so this is a long game, and I don't envy the position of developers, because you're having to come up with like the capital now, knowing that you necessarily won't get a return for a while, and so on the ancillary, I think where we really need to work on is identifying some of those, particularly for the distributed solar, what are some of the locational values of that? And I'm sorry, distributed storage, locational values. And this is what's going to be interesting about this distribution planning process, is that the utilities are being asked to come forward and identify what are the benefits and the costs of distributed resources at certain locations. And that's just a lift that just hasn't been done. And so it's really groundbreaking, but it's also, I think, if I had to put my own money up, I'd be cautious. So. But please put your own money.
One more wish list. I think it's to continue one of the things that the PUC has been doing through the on-bond meetings with the other agencies. I think a year or two ago, one of the big concerns that I think all of us who participate as stakeholders in the system were concerned about was that you kind of have this balkanized system. You got the PUC, and they're worried about costs, and you got the ISO, they're worried about how the system works, and reliability, and you've got the CPUC off thinking about big stuff and where we're going. But it wasn't clear sort of how all those different agencies were going to work together in a coordinated way to deliver this big transformation. And I think it's good that coordination between the agencies is actually starting to bear fruit, and that's useful. So I think continuing that. And I think the next big challenge that's going to come down is the fact that as you really start to wrap your head around the 80-32 goals, it's really clear that California, as much as we like to talk about everything from the perspective of our state, really can't get there on our own. We're going to have to actually reach out and work with our neighbors across the West for some of these reasons. So one of the things, there are a handful of ideas out there that I think, when you think about solar resources or wind resources, the more geographic diversity you get, the more stability you get in terms of there being power available. Solar is a great example. Sort of just even across the western region, when the sun's shining in Nevada, it's still dark here, you can be getting solar energy flowing westward. And similarly, at the end of the day, as Las Vegas is lighting up, California is still bathed in sunshine, and be pushing power towards Nevada. It solves that other problem you mentioned and described it as well in your opening comments, which is the big challenge we face is not so much reliability, it's this question of what do we do with all this excess energy? And there are technical answers, but they're also just interconnecting with our neighbors will provide us with additional places to push power, pull power. And so I think moving the agencies off beyond sort of thinking purely about California, but shifting the beginning to think about how a system works and it's integrated with neighbors is going to be key.
Yeah, I think that is true, and I think there's some really interesting work that's happening with some of the Western states and with the ISO in particular in terms of the energy imbalance market and thinking about how do we coordinate our resources. On this coordination issue, first of all, I think it's important to have strong executive leadership for that. I mean, the reason we all get together monthly as agencies is because we have a governor and governor's advisors who expect that and who say coordinate on these issues. And there are certain problems that are easier to coordinate on than others. I mean, when each person has a distinct role, each agency, it becomes easier. I'll make this plea though, because you're the business community and legislators like you because you're the business community, and make the call for, the thing about coordination is it takes actual bodies, and you don't usually get staff to do coordination. And so when people do it, it's that extra step to not just do your work, but to pick up the phone and call your colleague at that board and that board. And so we do that already with existing staff, and as the opportunities have grown tremendously on the energy side in the last 10 years. But I can't say our staff has. So we have 2 people who work part-time on energy storage in addition to the assigned office. Our people who do our climate change work, those 2 are also the same people who do electric vehicles. And so I am sensitive, it bemoans me that our proceedings take so long, and I know it frustrates all of you. And partly it's not for lack of appreciation or care, it's just that there were so many different proceedings and projects were happening. When we do your complaints, people complain about their bills, we handle that. So it's like a small claims court and then a big Supreme Court at the same time. So
Generates so much reading.
yes, just the paper industry that we are keeping in business. And so it kind of sounds a little self-serving to say, oh, what do we need? But we just need resources. We need people who can actually take the time to step back from the car that's moving fast and say, what do we need to do? You need parallel people. You need someone who's working on the current program and then who's thinking about the future one. We also have a significant part of our workforce is going to be retiring in the next couple of years. And you just you on a personal level, I love it when someone retires or has a baby. On a professional level, I'm like, no, don't leave me. Because you can leave, the entire proceeding can be derailed for a year for things like that. And so, we have our own challenges we're facing in terms of public perception, and I think government is in general. And so I would say in the process of that, let's not overcomplicate things. Let's keep, it's good to have oversight, it's good to have accountability, but we also need staff to be able to do that.
Indeed.
So come work for us, Arno.
It's so much fun on the private side of things.
Yeah.
Well, I'm
Yes,
interested
that's the benefit of the private side.
in what the rest of the audience thinks about these issues, because I think we could go on all night. There'd probably be like 2 periods talking about, what market is going on.
My name is Steve Larson. I'm with California Strategies, and I'm fascinated by this conversation which you don't get to hear very often. I think that in terms, we're in a time that is really revolutionary. All sorts of changes are taking place. And we're talking about technological changes that basically are going to change the fundamentals of how you regulate the industry. And this hasn't happened since really 1910, when the original decisions were made about how to regulate utilities in the United States, here in California first. What really bothers me, you were getting at this at the end. I think the technology part will take care of itself. We'll just keep going. We're a state that does that. And in terms of storage, I think that is a remarkable game changer. And what the PUC has done is it said, okay, utilities, we'll pay for it. You'll pay for it. Consumer will pay for it. But you go sell this technology. You find something. We're incenting the solutions to the technology. That's amazing. But okay. So what really bothers me is what you were getting at when you were talking about coordination between the entities. Because this is an old system that we have that regulates. And these are independent regulators. And there's no one of them. They all have different, really fundamental responsibilities, and they answer to no one. At least 5 organizations: PUC, the CEC, the ISO, and the ARB, also the Water Board, which is now becoming more involved. And it came up over time, and there were reasons why it was organized this way. But there really needs to be true harmony, because with all of these technologies rushing at us, and Carla, as you were talking at the end about your staff retiring, about all these very practical issues, and it's true everywhere, and we don't have a way of coping with this. And yet the technologies, the questions about technology are growing and growing and growing. It takes 18 months to get through a single proceeding today. It's going to take 2 years before very long, and it isn't just a matter of new staff. It is a matter of thinking through how to reform the system. And the governor doesn't want to deal with it. As long as the lights don't go out and they're running things and he doesn't have too many complaints, that's fine. As as long as you have the kind of personalities that came out of the 2000 experience and the crisis of 2000, all the heads of all the agencies that I just mentioned now, all came out of the crisis of 2000 in one form or another. They all experienced what happened during that time, and I think it made them work together. That's going to change. These people are going away. And the new types that become heads of these different agencies, who knows what it's history to them what happened in 2000. What happened was the lights went out. And politicians can't take that. So you've got to figure out a new system. And I don't see anybody trying to do that. I mean, in a comprehensive way. You talk about each agency, but what about your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, those are all good observations. I think it is happening. Maybe we need to be talking about how it's happening better, but and I'll start with someone else's experience and come back to us. So there's been a lot of interest in New York, has been doing this proceeding, this kind of, I forget what it's called, but it's like the 21st century grid effectively, and what are the different technical, economic things that you need to do, what does rates need to look like in order to have this grid that we're talking about. And it's been applauded appropriately because it is this comprehensive framework that is getting to the regulatory model. I mean, this is also another way of saying this is what do utilities look like in the future, and therefore what does your regulatory commission need to look like in the future. So there's that type of work happening somewhere like New York. When I look at what they're doing in New York, we're doing pretty much all the elements of what they're doing in individual proceedings. And let me make a couple comments on that and then welcome suggestions. Sometimes things are taking a long time because things are complicated because they're new and we don't have a standardized way to do them. So we have a proceeding right now on risk-based decision making, right? Risk-based rate making. How do we incorporate this notion of uncertainty and risk into the rate making process? But when we get through this proceeding, I think that is going to make rate cases go faster. Because one of the challenges right now when I get a rate case is you're starting to look at things that aren't comparable to times before. And so that is just a lot of churn has to come to analysis. But if you can create more standardized structures for evaluating these things, things will go faster. The same thing with something like, we're in a lot of churn right now. Like, what does net metering look like? What do EVs look like? At some point, we're going to figure it out, and the system is just going to go a little faster. So I do think things are moving in the right direction. In terms of comprehensively, how does the regulatory system need to change? Does it? I think it does. I think it's going to change regardless. But I'd be interested, of the things that you were concerned with, what is like kind of the highest priority lack of coordination aspect you think? Because we do have 4 years, well, maybe I should assume, probably have 4 years with this governor going forward, and so you still have that leadership. But I appreciate that a lot of things are driven by personalities now versus institutionalized.
We definitely share that frustration sometimes. I mean, it's just when we've tried with some of our trade associations to draw a map of all the different proceedings that deal with a certain issue, and you suddenly have to be involved in 3 different proceedings and 3 different venues, and they're going at different timelines.
And it's all really expensive.
It's all very expensive. That's exactly right. So it imposes a sort of cost that means that only bigger companies that have the deeper pockets can produce it and feel unfair. And I think a former commissioner, Diane Grunick, wrote an interesting paper at the Little River Commission at Stanford, basically talking about this complexity. Unfortunately, I think the suggested solution was to put another agency on top of it. It's going to be difficult to make work. But I mean, where I've come to is just classic compromise, which is you're either working with the existing system, which we know how to do, and they are figuring out how to make it work as creative as it works, versus finding the political will to make that change. And that political will, that's the problem. The governor doesn't want to attack it, and it's hard to get. You don't know what you're going to get out of the legislature if you go and ask them for it. And so I think everyone's made that kind of ultimately kind of compromise to just say there's a way to work with the system.
And the system isn't just the regulators, the government, we're all stakeholders in the system. So some things that help us are when parties go into settlement, right? For example, I mean, I also encourage people, hey, probably things take a while if we got 20 people telling us to do 20 different things. Figure out amongst yourselves, what do you want to prioritize? I mean, sometimes this is what we'll call for in a proceeding. Tell us where you want us to focus, because ultimately, the reason we don't generate actually that many activities on our own, everything we're doing, for the most part, is response to something new coming to us, an application from a utility, a request for an OIR. So, it's kind of, if you want your issue taken care of, help us figure out where to prioritize.
I know from being board chair of SIA that that's harder to do than it sounds.
Hi, I'm Chris King with Siemens.
Hi.
First, I wanted to mention kind of points of information. You talked about real-time prices, and customers would need to have automated appliances for that to work. And there are actually some very successful programs where customers don't have any of that automation in their work. I think the key is that they're voluntary, opt-in. You don't force anybody. In fact, we ran a pilot in DC, and one of the areas we looked at was with low-income customers. And they saved, on average, percentage-wise, they actually saved more. And there were some other programs like that. So my question, I'm going to follow up on that question, and this actually goes to a project that we did with one of our clients in Austria, who's here today, actually. And what they found there was adding renewables to the grid caused a requirement for reinforcement. And you could reinforce traditionally, add transformers and lines, whatever, or you could do smart grid approach. And they found that they could do it for about half as much with the smart grid approach. And they told their other colleague utilities about this. They said, why would you want to do that? Because then you don't get the rate base. So I know they're looking at that in New York specifically, and how do you incentivize that kind of situation? But I was wondering if you have any thoughts or comments on it.
I'll just make the comment that I think that, one, I think, yes, we want to look at smart grid approaches, and we've been doing smart grid planning in the state, but the smart grid plans came out in 2011, before storage, before push on electric vehicles, and so it's time to dust them off. Ultimately, we're going to need so much generation, I think, in order to do electric vehicles and to do fuel cell vehicles, that conservation has to be as important as investment. Like, I don't think we can invest our way into an affordable future here. And so I think it's going to be some combination. So yeah, I think there's going to be various types of hardware for utilities to earn a rate base on. So the more we can do in terms of just making the system work smarter, I'm all for it.
I think, Chris, your question gets to a really interesting point, though, which is that part of this discussion as we transform the system is recognizing the impact it has on the utility and the business model there. And, I think there's a temptation or a tendency for that conversation to get into a kind of confrontational mode where, there are various parties that talk about sort of destroying the monopoly utility. And that one always causes me to scratch my head, because when I think the utility is a construct that we created to socialize the cost of more electric infrastructure, like the utility is us. Yeah. And we may get frustrated with the way it works, but at the end of the day, the system won't work if we don't have a viable entity that works both technically and administratively and financially to support it. And so a necessary part of this conversation is Siegelman in New York, the head of Recurrent. She's been really active. I think really important thing there has been connecting those two. You can't move the technical conversation forward without also moving the question forward about what role the utility plays there, and ensuring that the way you put it together results in an entity that's financially stable and can actually do its job.
I just want to say, I think you've thought a lot about this, and I really appreciate that. And I'll deal with sometimes new companies who are very dismissive of the utility and what they do, and it's like, be careful what you wish for. Without, the utility does a lot that I think is sometimes is not visible. We ultimately started with these vertically integrated utilities that we've unbundled, and we're still trying to figure out how to now provide everything they used to provide in the unbundled format. And so, it is valuable to be thoughtful about what the contribution is there.
Let's take a couple more questions if folks have interest, and then we've got some wine and cheese and crackers in the back, and I hope folks will be interested to stick around for a little while and meet your fellow attendees, and I hope our guests can stay as well.
So, hi, I'm Val Will. I'm with I'm just a real estate broker here in the city, but I'm the AP and I know more about this than I should. So I have a 10 kilowatt photovoltaic system. I have an EV. And the only thing I really feel like revolutionized was my furnace, my thermostat that I can control on the web. $299 part. Took a dumb system, completely automated, cut my gas bill like 50%. And I I think, God, if I just had something like that between the meter and my house, I could really do a lot of stuff. And it seems pretty simple, and this, again, this was I replaced a $49 thermostat with that. I just feel like you're missing some opportunities here that are much simpler. And we are going through a revolution. And the technology is going much faster than the organizations can function at it. It's going to change, and I feel to like myself, hey, in 3 years, I'm going to be off the grid. And it won't be an effort. It'll be a $59 part, and I'll be off. And a battery system or something. And it's just amazing to me. So I throw that out there as just an average consumer, non-engineer, started playing with this stuff, and wow, it's incredible. So you keep talking 2 to 3 years, and I feel like you can't do that. I reduced my gas bill by 50% in 1 year with one part. I mean, you got to react, and I think you got to really shake it up. And yeah, I think Mr. Brown's, our governor, has got to get on this because I don't think he sees it. And I see the biggest battery pack in the world being our dams. You know, you close down the chutes for the water coming out, you're storing a lot of energy. It seems pretty simple to turn off a valve, and maybe I'm old-fashioned. But you know, I recognize you got fish and everything else on the but it's not that complex in some issues at some level. And if anybody's fished the Tuolumne River, 10 a.m. in the morning, the river goes from nothing to a wild stream, and then it shuts back down again. I go, well, they can do that every day. Why can't they do that more efficiently?
So we do use pumped hydro, so there's like homes, and so I think, to your point, yes, people are really looking at that option, and I think your story is inspiring. I don't think it's such a simple fix for everyone.
Right.
You know, really, so much of the challenge too is homes are different, climate zones are different, but I like your approach of saying, don't overcomplicate it.
Yeah.
But I do think, I mean, I think people do see it. I mean, Google just paid how many billion for a smart thermostat company? I mean, there is a recognition that there is some device in the home that is going to have that ability to deliver that kind of economic benefit to the customer and choice, right? I mean, I think the powerful thing there, I mean, the cost impact is important, but it's that sense of empowerment you get as a customer that you never had before. And I think, you know, Nest, your smart thermostats could be that center. I know there are smart inverter companies that are also looking at being a kind of like hub in the home. One way or the other, I agree with you. We're heading towards a place where there's going to be a device that makes some pretty simple decisions for you about when to turn things on and off and saves a tremendous amount of electricity. You touched on another question, which is one that I think people wrestle with a lot, which is this idea of people exiting the grid. And there are certainly people who are going to be able to do that. I mean, if you put a battery bank and a solar power system up on a roof, if you've got enough space for a big enough system, you can actually cut the cable to the utility and exist on your own. But the reality is that's probably only true for somewhere between maybe 15 and 20% of electricity customers. I mean, if you look around here, nobody's got the roof space. You know, if you think about hospitals, if you think about apartment buildings, you think about businesses, almost nobody's got the roofs. None of those customers have the roof space to be able to generate enough power and the building space to have enough on-site storage. And so you're going to need, the system is going to be needed one way or the other. And so some people will defect, but I think there's still going to be the vast majority of customers that are going to need to stay connected. And it's fundamentally public good, and it's something we have to make sure works.
All right, I want to thank all of you for attending today, and especially thank you, Arno and Carla, for a fascinating discussion. I hope we can continue the discussion over wine and cheese and in the weeks and months to come. And please stay tuned to Bay Area Council activities. We will be unveiling the 21st Century Initiative report in the next couple of months, and we'll have an ongoing series of opportunities to learn more about the issues and how to drive 21st century infrastructure forward in California. Thank you all very much.